Welcome everyone joining us around the world for our Ask the Howlers session. And yes, we are live again. It's such a pleasure to host you all. For those who don't know me and you didn't watch the last session, my name is James Aliband, and Senior Security Strategist and Manager of Product Marketing at VMware. Just before we dive into the session, remember this is a security expert roundtable. So this is where trusted advisors and security strategists join me to discuss the latest threats, security challenges, providable, actionable tips, resources, and of course, most importantly, to answer your questions as well. Last time out, we were joined by none other than Tom Kellerman and Rick McElroy discussing the Modern Bank Heist report and how organizations, especially in the financial sector, can better protect themselves. So just before I do introduce my guest today, and the topic, of course, I want to remind you all that we do have the Q&A. The Q&A was awesome last time, and I really want to bring that to life, throw as many questions. And of course, as we're live today as well, and answering a few of them, another ask I've got is when you're posting your questions to the Q&A, I want to know where all of you are, where you're from, which state you are, which country you live in as well. I want to see how many different time zones we've got joining us today. So tell me where you're from as well. Tell me your name, where you're from, and what your question is. So with that, the topic we're going to be discussing today, we're going to be discussing adding the sec into DevSecOps. So let's dive in and introduce my guests. First and foremost, I am super excited to welcome Sanara Marsh. Sanara's the Manager of Technical Product Marketing at VMware, and by night, of course, a security strategist. Sanara, great to have you.
It's a pleasure to be here, James.
And thank you for joining. And also, as you can see, just joined me as well is David Zendzian as well. Now, David is a global field CISO for our VMware Tanzu team as well. David, great to have you here.
Excited to be here. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, we're going to have so much fun over the next 20 or so minutes. So before we jump in, as you all know, I love to have an icebreaker. Before we jump in, I want to know, what's the best thing that happened to you guys in 2020? This can be personal, it can be business, I don't mind. Sanara, ladies first.
I know it's a tough one for everyone, especially when we start to hear where all of you guys are from. I would say probably the best thing is that my dog is extremely happy, and I don't know how well she's going to take when we have to go back into work and whatnot, but never had a happier golden retriever in my life, so...
Yeah, there's so many happy dogs around the world at the moment, isn't there? Living under desks or chilling around, seeing their parents around.
On my feet, always, you know.
Exactly, keeping you on your toes. And David, how about yourself?
I could go similar way with pets, or like get all cheesy and talk about how being with my family is great, which it is. Don't get me wrong, it's awesome. But honestly, being able to work from my boat occasionally, because you're working from home, you really can't beat that.
Oh man. So you've taken work from home to the next level, and it's work in the boat, on the lake, in the sea.
In the water, yeah. Just go out, and I'll go out for a half an hour cruise somewhere, and just throw the anchor, and just put my Wi-Fi up, and just sit there with the dolphins going around me, maybe an otter going past it. You can't beat it.
Yeah,
that's taken.
I know it's not typical, but I mean, it's really helping for anyone hiring into like SOC teams and all of this, like being able to work from a boat from Texas, from wherever. It's really great, to be honest.
Yeah, it's really accelerate. Like that's an interesting thing as well, especially with the narrative of working from a boat, right? But ultimately, like, especially as we move forward, that true working from anywhere, like that truly resonates, work from a boat or work from the airport, work from your nan's house, work from, it doesn't matter. As long as you're working, that's the most important thing, of course. Just before we just dive into today's topics, I'm super keen to dig deep into. For all the listeners out there, let's give a 30-second minute roundup of like who you are, where you're based, what do you get up to on the weekend. David, how about yourself? You jump in first.
So I'm in South Carolina. I live down near Hilton Head, but I grew up in Charleston, so the whole low country of South Carolina is home. And weekend is always going to be the boat again. That's my go-to answer for things to do. If I'm not working on technology, you can see I've got monitors all over the place. I got my own embedded programming system back here. So I do like to hack on things. I'm wearing my hack hat today because I give credit back to the old DEF CON party from that. But it's every day is really an interesting conversation with the most intelligent and smartest customers I've ever met in my life, having the best security conversations in the world. And I was just doing I was watching a roundtable from KubeCon, and I actually reached out to a VP from Citi talking to him. I mean, he inspired me, and I had to really reach out and say and connect. And it turns out that naturally we have a couple of contacts in common. But I'm actually looking forward to when we can actually travel again. I can get out to the UK and actually sit down with a cup of coffee and have a really great conversation again.
And you are more than welcome here whenever you want. Like, I can tell you that now. As soon as you're over, we'll definitely meet up and go for some food. Sanara, over to yourself.
So I'm actually originally from Minnesota, Wisconsin. I noticed it when I said something earlier here. It comes out every now and then, but I do live in the Boston area now, and I like being outside as well. So it's been nice in the pandemic having to get outside more than being stuck inside, but I'm hoping that it'll continue with the ability to travel and whatnot. But I do like getting out there camping, hiking, fishing, whatever that may be. So.
No, that's awesome. And Sanara, another question on that, because, and diving into kind of, why we're here and why we talk about security, where did it all start for you? Over to Boston, of course, but also in the security industry.
It's interesting for me because I wanted to join an industry where I was going to be stretched to learn constantly. I graduated as an industrial engineer, which has nothing to do with computers or cybersecurity, but I wanted to be in an industry where what I knew today was not the same as what I needed to know last week or last month. And security is that spot. And so I joined Carbon Black and have been a part of the acquisitions, the mergers, all of that. And so it's been a real learning journey. And I think along the process, learning why people have to secure, what kind of risk they're exposed to, and the different implementation procedures has started to lead me to evangelism. And I think what was interesting for me coming from a novice background is starting to learn how to teach novice users security, right? It's something that we're seeing the skills gap. I know it's not what we're talking about today, but we see deficits everywhere. And so people that are in IT that don't have security exposure or training are getting forced into these roles. And so I really like the evangelist opportunity to start talking about what can you leverage, even open source tools or free resources to increase your knowledge and start learning and knowing how to implement security.
No, that's awesome. And for the listeners that don't know as well, and Sanara and I work on the same team. Sanara's just been recently promoted to manager of technical marketing, so a huge congratulations on that side as well. But yeah, I certainly second the roller coaster that acquisitions and being part of VMware. It's a great, it's a super, awesome journey to be on. David, how about yourself? Where did it all start, and why are you here today?
I'll try to talk too long in this, and I'm probably going to date myself a little bit on here. So I got into tech a long time ago, back even before the internet. I ran bulletin boards back when they were popular, and did security ever since I got online. It's always been part of what I did, but there was no security industry, there's no security jobs. I actually have a folder I built back from when I was 15, 16 years old. We didn't even have the internet. This is like things I would find on Usenet, and I'd print it out and put it into a notebook. But I grew up pretty much doing the IT work, the programming work, working with the actual development side. I worked in shipping and freight forwarding coming out of college, where it's multi-state networks. And in fact, it's really interesting thinking of that today, where the largest ship to ever hit the United States came to Savannah just this week. It was in Charleston earlier. It's like 30,000 containers on this ship. And when I first started in the shipping industry, when the ship would come into the port, they would actually do the mapping of how you unload and load a ship, because when you're doing this, you have to plan for the next 4 or 5 stops the ship goes. They did it with index cards and a bottle of whiskey in the middle of the floor, and it'd be an all night effort to plan how to unload ships. And I was there for the transition from that to AS400s, the mic, up the whole path. And I've been doing this ever since then. I joined the .com boom out in California when that happened. Came back here, went to New York and helped a bank start. I've done everything in the security space, from code review, forensic engineer. I was a PCI QSA. It is my passion, my hobby, my life, and my wife has a lot of patience with me.
Now, David, is it because of the container ships that you're now into containers?
Oh, that's it. my 15-year-old would really appreciate that joke. So
No, that's brilliant. And it's great to build the context as well, and to really dive in. I think for all of us, security's been such a big part of our life, no matter how long that journey has been. And certainly not pointing to you there, David, but, from that point of view, it's truly a big passion of ours. And diving into, kind of one of the areas that I think I'm super interested here. And one of the questions I actually really wanted to ask you guys, especially when we think about how security has been such a big part of our lives, is creating healthy relationships in organizations as well. And when we think about, the topic today around DevSecOps and developer security and operations, and then of course we think about breaking those out into DevOps and security, where did this all start and how did we really get to, where we are today? And feel free, whoever wants to jump in here first.
Oh, that's such a loaded question. There's so many.
We got time to answer.
It's you're looking at the idea of it really is a balancing of the teams. There's a big misnomer that DevSecOps or shifting left is really just saying, developers or product teams, you own security now. We're going to give it to you and security teams are out of the loop. That's the farthest from the truth. And as far as where it came from, I can remember being at Wells Fargo 25 years ago where we actually had balanced teams then, where I was a security consultant to the business units, consulting on projects to tell them how to meet policies while you're developing applications. It's the same mindset you bring to DevSecOps now, where you have a balancing of the teams. It's actually, I'm excited because it's a chance to build some bridges, get rid of silos, get people working better together. When you treat each product as a real product and you have the proper people around to make this a real endeavor, you're able to design security from the very beginning. We know that you can't add it in the end. You can't do things in the middle. It ends up being this huge stopgap of people trying to bolt security on the end or trying to make things fit situations. And you can't do that. It has to be from the very beginning. And there are tools we can get developers to move faster. And that's really what I think is what's changing today is the automation we learned with DevOps and we learned with actually changing immutable environments that have automated infrastructures are now available. And security teams, I hope we can get some developers back into security teams. There was a time when because we were generalists, there weren't very specific specialties who were focused on malware or incident response or whatever it might be. Security teams are lacking that developer side. So they need to have that proper balancing to bring developers back into security and consume APIs, which I think is a big piece of what Sanara, you and your teams work with, is making APIs available for security teams.
And I think it's really key because what we've seen with containers is, yes, a rapid adoption because of a variety of reasons, right? Increasing velocity, making sure you're addressing customer needs. But the concern, or I think where the shift in the silos have come from, is that the traditional security role is no longer the traditional security role in the context of containers, because oftentimes, because developers are building and deploying these applications, it's their ownership and their domain. But what we have a false assumption around is that if containers are in their essence more contained, then why does security have to be a part of it? Or it just becomes an afterthought. And so this DevSecOps concept is because there is absolutely risk. There's always risk. Adversaries are intelligent and they have broad resources to be able to infiltrate in. And so if we're not thinking about hygiene on these mission critical applications, how are we going to be successful? And I think that's a portion of what is contributing to the silos, because it is developer owned. But how do we start to get security a part of it? Because typically the connotation of security is that there's going to be additional friction that gets added because there's some sort of security agent or complexity or rules that you have to follow that you wouldn't otherwise have to follow.
No, absolutely. And I think, you touched on a really good point there actually as well. And whoa, haven't we seen it over the last 6 months? The last 6 months, I think that cyber insurgency in that sense has been just crazy for us all. Did we predict it? I guess we could argue that in a positive way. When we talk about building and really driving these teams together, like, what do you think the showstoppers are? No, not necessarily the showstoppers. Let's say the hurdles in that perspective. What do we really have to get over?
Oh, you go ahead first. If you...
Mine's just a simple point because there's many different hurdles, I think, but I think it's just the concept of how do we align the goals? Because the goals of the developer is around velocity and time to production, or making sure that they're delivering that value at an increased time. And security has to make sure that you're following guidance and guardrails. And so how do we marry the two that we're still meeting both of those goals and not hindering either one of the teams? And so I think that's a big hurdle. That's why we're talking about DevSecOps, is what is the unified goal? How do we make sure that we're not creating more friction for the teams?
I was going to say the exact same thing, but a different way. That each team speaks a different language. You know, they're the way that they do what they do is slightly different, and their objectives, they say their goals, what they're trying to achieve, is a different mission. You know, one is, and the security mission is changing. At one point, it was security teams were blockers; they were trying to prevent things from happening, and over the time, it's come to acknowledge that you can't prevent it, but we can limit it through risk management. It's been changing to a risk management process. And that's easier to fit with the goals of developers. It's no longer such a hard hurdle, but there's a lot of pieces moving there. And there's a lack of understanding on both sides of what each team is doing, why they're doing it, and how they're doing it. And the best example probably would be in just like in vulnerability scanning. The development teams are happy to have vulnerability scanning, but they have no idea what it means to have those results. They need to have someone who understands those results, who may not know the application, talk together. You can't do this separately. Slack is great, but you need to get to a point where you have a whiteboard, you're doing diagrams, you're putting the pieces together, and that's how it's going to be solved.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to be able to, collaborate effectively. It's so important. I completely hear you there. You think about a sports team, for example, everyone has their specific roles on that team. They're specialists in their own right. You've got a quarterback or a running back. It's how they can actually work together. It's not necessarily, the quarterback's not going to say, oh, hey, you're doing your job wrong. Fine, okay? Let's work together on this. And you see the best teams on the pitch. You see that where they truly work together as a good operational team. And I think exactly what you're talking about there as well. David, you mentioned something earlier, and I wanted to pick up on it, the screen. And I love the screens in your office. And I want to touch on that just a second, because if we think about over the last 15 months that everybody's been, there you go, look at those. That's a sock bought home, isn't it? And I want to touch on that just a second, actually, as well, because one of the things that I think is so interesting is how, you've just mentioned about collaboration and how do people collaborate effectively. And that's really important to DevSecOps. But now we're all remote and at home, as you can see with us all. How do we do that effectively in this environment?
It's really hard. Transparency, honesty. You have to communicate and share your intent and listen for if someone doesn't understand what you're saying. It's very hard. I talk to a lot of companies, and the hardest thing I have is if you don't turn your cameras on, it's impossible to know if someone's understanding or not. And even at that point, you get into a meeting with 40, 50 people, you'll never know. And that's where I'm personally missing, the chance of being interaction face-to-face. I think you can work great remote. I did remote for many, many, many years before it became popular with COVID. And it works great, but there's a time and a place you can leverage tools. Like I use Miro a lot to do whiteboarding. There's a lot of things you can do, and there's tools to make this easier. But sometimes you just have to fly across to California and get on a whiteboard. It just makes it easier, and it's going to be harder over time because now we are truly distributed. I can't think of any company that's not moving toward the path of saying you can work anywhere. And how do we facilitate this? Because there have been development hubs. You look at any major corporation, they'll have a team in India, or a team in California, a team in DC, a team in New York. They're hubs of development, and they might have some people working remote as part of that, and they work with their own flow and style. But generally, you would have it, people be able to get together at some point. Technology is making it easier, but it's not going to solve all of it.
Yeah, and I think too, in the context of DevSecOps, what I've seen be successful, because collaboration across the board is really challenging, but I think this is almost too big of a problem to solve just at security and dev level. You need C-level buy-in. The teams that I've seen be successful or have had conversations around that are successful in their strategy is because their C-level executives say, hey, this is what we are planning to do, and in order to be successful, this is what we need to do. So sometimes it's challenging to do team to team if you don't have the executive buy-in, and I feel like it has to start from that level. And I know, David, you coming from that perspective, I don't know if you have another additional color around that, but I think it is needed in order to be successful.
It's hard to break through these silos if you don't have someone above them saying you have to work together. You will always have people defending their little fiefdom, and it makes it that difficult conversation if you don't have the executive buy-in. And it's hard because a lot of executives don't have the background of managing remote workforces or having a business. So for them, it's new too. And it's scary and it's different. And how do they know if their teams are working and empathizing and working well together? And I look at VMware, we have our Epic 2 standards and the ways we actually try to intentionally do things. And it's important to have that guidance in a company. And it was important why I joined Pivotal. The missions of how the business itself supports its teams to work together and be honest and transparent and do the right thing. It's important.
No, I can certainly second that around like joining Black and joining VMware. I think culture, people are all truly important things. I think Sanara and I, we can both agree on, we both have very global teams, and that, from time zones to business to personal to family, all of those different things, like it's opened up creative, fantastic opportunities. But at the same time, we've had to also be cautious about how do we operate that team and how do we build that? Just jumping forward. Go ahead, David, go ahead.
I was going to see a question that came on before we leave the subject. Is the buy-in from the CIO or CISO? I think it's the entire executive staff. It has to come from the CEO saying this is a mission and a reason for us to function as a business, and then the leadership of the company has to be behind it. It can't be an individual. It really has to be company-wide. And I want to clarify one thing, that I'm not in the boat right now. This is my home office.
I think that's a great point as well. I think, one of the things that we always emphasize is, not only from, I know, Sanara, you and I feel strongly about this around, where should the CISO be reporting, right? And how should that security conversation make board level? And I think that, again, emphasizes that fact that the CISO really should be reporting to the board and having that conversation with the board. But the exec buy-in, I think, David, you touched on that elegantly, is that has to be a board level decision. We all need to be having that conversation across the board.
And I think the reason, if this isn't the tone that's set at the top, I think that there has to be education around this as well. To the point that I mentioned where containers are more contained, that could just be the general notion as well at the top level. So there may not be any need for collaboration because they don't see that. But if we understand that containers are housing those business critical applications, and what's the impact if that goes down for 20 minutes, for an hour, for a day, start talking about the risks that are posed to containers, whether it's container escape or something related. We need to expose them to that information and educate them, because even ourselves in security, we're educating ourselves around what those risks are. So how is someone at the C-level position supposed to know and understand those components as well?
Or even the board, if we were talking really board level.
No, you're absolutely spot on. I think that, and this sets me up so nicely for my second question around strategy, and I think this is perfect in that sense. I think what all of our listeners really need to, and I think with the questions coming in with that narrative as well, is what really should be the top focuses for organizations in 2021 and beyond, and really how should we be adopting change but driving change?
It's tough to have just one strategy for this in general, but if we're kind of wrapping everything into one story here with the remote workforce, with the different risks to containers, to different applications, I feel like it's got to be education around that strategy that's going to bring you together, right? It's unification of that strategy, because at the end of the day, security is accountable for security. So how are you going to, for lack of a better word, cover yourself, right? Make sure that you are protected. And if it's not uniform, if it's not something that's cloud hosted, right? You're all remote. If we don't have access to the same data and we don't have some sort of strategy, how are we supposed to be successful across the business when we know that organizations are more distributed, more BYODs than we've seen in the past?
I'll add on that one. I think that there's definitely a struggle on companies on trying to do everything at once. There's, as Sanara's mentioned, and James, we talked about earlier, there's so many pieces here. There's so much needs to be done. If we just focus on application containers, there's so much needs to be done, let alone even focusing on remote workforce and the fact that some of your workforce can't work remote. They need to work in offices. Some people it's not, they can't work remotely. We have to be able to empathize with all of that, but how do we actually get to a point where we can actually make this real? If you're trying to solve everything all at once, you'll never get there. How do we break it down? And that's where I see is happening is people are getting really focused on what can we get done day one? How can we iterate on that? Treating this whole process itself as this agile, extreme type of development. It is an iterative process. We need to have retros, see what didn't work. We need to analyze and be honest with ourselves of what does work and doesn't work. How do we iterate on that and make it better every day? And that over time, you build a program that has all the things you want to have, which you didn't know from the very beginning. Because, Sanara mentioned, we're learning things every day. Things are changing so rapidly. Even just trying to pay attention to like the cloud native, security forums that are out there. The number of messages and communications going on is more than any one person can keep up on. And don't try. Start off with what you can handle. Just make sure you're doing authentication, you're doing logging, the basics, the table stakes of the basics of security. Your inventory. Honestly, I think one of the biggest things we're going to see in the next couple of years is the software bill of materials and the security around the container pieces. The tools we have today, just like we had the tools when we shifted from VMs to containers. We had Tenable and we had Qualys and Rapid7, those tools doing vulnerabilities. They didn't right away, just like Microsoft didn't right away support the internet. These tools didn't support containers right away. Now they do. And as we're going further down the stack from containers to the applications, the software bill of materials, and we eventually get to a distro-less container where you don't have those inventories of the packages besides a bill of materials, that's going to change how we do security. And if we get into a day when actually vendors are having much more transparency on what vulnerabilities are, it can change the whole dynamics around everything on how we do asset management, inventory, upgrades and patching and everything that drives the compliance in the backside.
Yeah, and I don't know if you look ever at the cyber maturity framework, but that could be a good place to start as well, because if you're overwhelmed with where to start, I like how they outline it in phases, because you don't have to be at that top level phase tomorrow. It's not normally possible, and it's very overwhelming. And so sometimes it's like you said, just starting with the basics, which I like the maturity framework for outlining, because it tells you what those basics are so that you can continue to mature your posture across endpoints, workloads, and containers, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so key, isn't it? Sticking to principles. I think first and foremost, you have to have your principles. And actually, the most important part of that is organizations' principles may be different one to another. And that's okay. Like, we all don't have to be the same. And then I think, again, like what you just said, Sanara, is so key. It's not trying to do this all at once, not spinning 10,000 plates and trying to achieve, cyber maturity overnight. Cybersecurity and DevOps and DevSecOps, it's all a journey. And we're all on that journey, which is exciting, but we can continue to be on that journey. Guys, this has been truly, exhilarating, and honestly, like, it really has been really great to have you on here. We've also touched on the Q&A as we've been going through, and, I'm just going to actually jump through and say that we've had people, as I asked, for people's locations, we've had people joining from Morocco, from Cincinnati, Cayman Islands, Florida, Italy, San Diego, Rhode Island, Texas, Arizona. Of course, we've got David, you're not on your boat, but not far from your boat, I'm sure. North Wales, so about an hour away from where I am. We've got people from all around the world here, which is absolutely awesome. And I just want to say thank you for everybody for joining, of course, as well. But, of course, back to both yourselves. Thank you so much. It's been an honor to host this session. It really has. I've learned so much from both of you, and your expert insights and your knowledge for ultimately for the cyber community as well. I'm seeing we've got London, we've got Long Beach, Colorado. This is awesome. Thank you both so much for joining us today. This has been truly exhilarating.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
And of course, over to our listeners as well. Thank you so much for joining and attending the Ask a Howler session. This has been a live session. It will be on demand as well, so share it out, start retweeting and sharing it on Facebook and everything, and get it splashed all over social media. But just before you go, I do have two things. First and foremost, I'm so keen to focus on the topics that you want to know and everything that you're interested in. So feel free to drop into the comments or submit into Carbon Black on topics that you want us to talk about. Now, that gives us the opportunity to bring in the speakers, bring in people from across the cyber community, which is exactly what we want to do. And of course, for the next live stream as well. Secondly, as I said, I've got two things. We also have our premier security event, VMware Security Connect, next week. It's virtual, it's free, which is, everyone likes a freebie, of course. And of course, it's virtual as well. This is where we're going to get insights from our latest security innovations, hear from our leaders, our updates and strategy, and of course, our fantastic Howlers as well. myself, Sanara, I know we've got sessions on there. We're super excited and joining the cyber community again. So with that, I'm going to wrap this all up. Thank you from wherever you are, whether it's good morning, good afternoon, but